Hi EDL 629. This is an introduction to Week 10, Racial Segregation, Desegregation, and its Discontents. And everything for this unit is due Thursday, April 6th at 11:59 p.m. First, an update on how we're doing. I have all of your quiz number 2s graded, so you can check those out. And the discussion about the Native American Miamia curriculum has been terrific. I'm really glad that you like that stuff. It's really interesting. I added on the discussion in response to Carl's question a description about the Miami University class on the history of Miamia. It's an undergraduate class, but it's offered usually every spring, so keep your eye out for it if you're around next spring. And then also there are only 3 more weeks to go in the semester, and the only work that we have left to do is another quiz, the final quiz, which works as sort of a final exam, but it's also open book, and then the 2 projects that you have. So that's where we are. Things are looking good. It's springtime. Okay, so where we are now. We're now still in Unit 3, which is called History and Contemporary School Reform, and as we did with the Miamia class last week, we'll do with upcoming readings on race, disabilities, gender, and then a special class on urban and suburban schooling. Sort of a little bit about place-based history of education. And so in all of these units, we're thinking about history, but we're also thinking about contemporary issues as well. In this week, Week 10, Racial Segregation, Desegregation, and its Discontents, it gets us thinking a lot about past and present. So first what you're going to do is watch a short overview of the important 1954 Supreme Court decision, the Brown versus the Board of Education. Then you'll read 2 articles that raise really interesting and challenging questions about the impact of the Brown decision, and particularly about racial segregation. And essentially those articles ask you, was racial desegregation the right thing to do? Was racial desegregation of schools the right thing to do? The obvious answer is yes, but these articles make you sort of think deeper about it. We had a little introduction to this question a few weeks ago with Heather Williams' really terrific chapter from Self-Taught that we read about in the Common School unit. And we also had in Quiz 2 a little introduction to this comment in one of the questions about the 1849 case of the city of Boston versus Roberts. And of course, the other article that we read that might help you reflect upon this is the Daniel Pearlstein article about progressive educational attempts in Arthurdale, West Virginia, which was progressive to some extent, but certainly not in another extent. The first discussion questions, there'll be 2 discussion questions this week. The first question is about the Vanessa Siddle-Walker piece and the Gloria Ladson-Billings article. And I ask you to zero in on their arguments and on their different approaches, given that Siddle-Walker is a historian who writes as a historian, and Gloria Ladson-Billings is a curriculum scholar, and she writes really more as a curriculum and policy person. How are their approaches different? But also, ultimately, what are they each arguing? And what do you think about their argument and about the implications of that argument? The second discussion question refers to my short little article on the history of desegregation of schools in Oxford, Ohio, attempt of desegregation of schools in late 19th century Oxford, Ohio, and Scott Baker's article on the history of teacher testing and race under desegregation. And these 2 articles address sort of specific systematic ways in which racial bias and exclusion has happened in schools. They both push the question of how and why racism works. In other words, racism is an individual act, but it's not always just an individual act. Racism is more systematic, and there's something systematic embedded in the organization, and that makes the whole sort of wheels of racism turn. Sometimes this is called institutional racism, and certainly we see this in school systems and in school policy in the past and in the present. So these essays are sort of 2 historical studies of how these dynamics work, and I ask you a question to sort of think about that. And so that's it. 2 questions for this week. I'll see you next week. Hope you're all well.